shared over a decade of work that we've done together on parent and family engagement in the higher ed context. This is definitely something that Judy and I partnered over a mutual interest in this idea about how we talk about parents and families in higher education. So one thing that we bonded over early on was this image of helicopter parents. And in the popular press, we see a lot of media depictions related to helicopter parents that has morphed into a number of different similar typologies of, bulldozer and Black Hawk parents, all negative images of how parents can hover and maybe take over on behalf of their students. And that in higher ed, there are conversations about how to manage and make sense of how to work with parents, but also always in a kind of limiting, how do we limit their involvement? How do we manage them? How do we um, kind of take care of students in ways that parents aren't? And then in contrast to this kind of hovering image, there were also some narratives and conversations about first generation college students. So those would be students whose parents did not attend higher education themselves and are the first in their families to pursue a college degree. And the narratives about first gen families was with this one quote, they may as well be watching their children from a space station. So this image of being completely removed, that this particular article talked about, give the kid $100, hope that they're going to be okay, and go and save the family. So some really problematic narratives about parents and families. And we really wanted to challenge those overarching descriptions or depictions of families, and how can we think about this differently? So there's some overarching assumptions that guide our work where we really want to challenge those deficit assumptions that parents and families have to be managed, that parents and families from first generation low income and communities of color don't care, that they do care, that they're very invested, they're very involved, and they might be involved and supportive in ways that higher education institutions are not seeing directly. Maybe those parents aren't calling those offices on campus or interacting with some staff members or faculty, but that they are huge supporters in their children's lives. And how can we account for that? And so our assumption is also that institutions have a responsibility to engage with these parents and families. So how can we do that in ways that are inclusive, that are culturally responsive, that really meet the needs of those families? So that's what our work has attempted to do. And there's a lot that we do know about parents and families in higher education. It is a more limited area. There's a lot more research on that PK-12 sector of education than there is for colleges and universities and the students that are attending higher education. But it's a growing area, and there is a lot of promising research about how parents can be beneficial to students, that their involvement can be positive for students' development, that there are ways that families are offering financial support, can help with mental health issues, manage roommate conflicts, attend to issues of student safety. And we'll talk about today how, sometimes parents and families are the first call that a student will make. And so there's a lot that parents and families are doing to offer that emotional support and other forms of support as well. But again, there's still these kind of labels of how do we manage and cope and ensure. So there's a little bit of skepticism within the research about parent and family engagement and whether it's a beneficial thing, and how much is too much and how much is too little. And so that's something that we've been kind of trying to better understand within our research too. But we definitely come at it from the perspective that we think that it is a good thing and that that's an important perspective to take on. So, in terms of this idea about parent and family engagement for first generation and families of color, I think what we've found is that it's so important to think about, beyond just parents. So, really, we've tried to expand our approaches to really think about families as a unit and how, there are lots of ways to think about the communities and the networks that families have to provide information and support for students. We know from the literature that college going activities are encouraged as early as elementary school. So there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge that can be a part of that. And that the values that are transmitted are really important in establishing that positive college going ideology. And so there's a lot of work that Judy and others have done about kind of funds of knowledge and the wealth of and wisdom that those communities provide. And we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that today too. Um, Within first generation parents and families, again, really some positive highlights of the fact that they offer emotional support is a key theme that we've seen in our own work as well. The families of these children want them to attend college. We'll share some of our results of just how excited the parents are that, they almost wanted to attend college with their, children too, because it's just such an exciting kind of life transition that they're really supportive of. Some of the research indicates that these families of first gen families are living close by, so, within 50 miles of about half of the students. So there's a familial connection there with distance. That's kind of a positive thing as well. And that those who do provide support have a higher chance of seeing their children graduate. So again, another positive outcome finding that the support does link to some positive student outcomes. So when we think about moving from this managing, limiting parents and families to more of an inclusive perspective where we do want their involvement and that we do think that that's a good thing, there are lots of possibilities related to how parents and families might be valued for that participation and can be included. And so there is, definitely still after all this work, Judy and I thought maybe we've been doing a good job of kind of going against that helicopter or bulldozer stereotype. And I don't know that we've moved the needle on that. It's still a persistent narrative, but being able to shift that perspective and think about how it can be beneficial to involve and to be inclusive of parents and families reveals a lot of different ways that we can partner with those parents. So we'll provide some of those examples today of ways that we've heard from within our data about how parents and families can be involved.
All right. Thank you, Cassandra. So Cassandra set the stage for us in terms of all of the bodies of literature, both research and scholarship, but then also, of course, popular press, media, social media now, and some of the more popular everyday types of depictions that we're seeing around parent and family engagement. And so we took that body of literature and really tried to think about what if we start to conceptualize a model that was more inclusive, that also addressed families and communities, networks and values and connections and support, and also talked about institutional responsibility, right? And so how and where and when institutions engage parents and families within post-secondary settings. And so what we have continued to play with over the last few years is this model of parent and family characteristics, engagement, and support. We drew a lot from Calabrese and Barton and their kind of body of work and colleagues around ecologies of parent engagement. And this EPE model was more K-12 focused, again, since the research and the work within this area in K-12 has been so robust. But we also coupled that with looking at literature and scholarship around collectivism, particularly when considering communities of color, and came to this continuously maybe model that we keep playing with and we keep adding to, and we keep thinking about how do we test it and how do we understand it. So I'll show you the actual figure in just a moment, but I want to explain it a little bit first. So at the center of the model, what you'll see is pre-college and college contributions of parents and families, linking contributions to students' outcomes. So not just academic outcomes or academic success metrics, which we know we have to understand and report on and study, but also the social and emotional outcomes as well. The shape of the model itself is circular or spiral, right? And so the model represents a lack of temporal order, a lack of steps, a lack of hierarchy regarding the various factors. And so one of the things that we want to continue to consider is that some of these things, some of these factors, some of these connections, some of these relationships, many of them, in fact, continue to evolve, continue to influence students' engagement, continue to influence parent and family engagement. So the pre-college characteristics that you'll see in the model include things like personal characteristics, school involvement, aspirations for the children that Casandra mentioned, the types of and the different forms of support that families might provide, their own self-efficacy or their confidence in navigating that system, and then the social networks that they turn to, that collectivist nature, right, that they turn to for resources and information. Um, Also the family and community context. And then, of course, the institutional context and the institutional responsibility, which we'll turn to quite a bit during the last part of what we share. But again, recognizing, right, and being cognizant of the fact that these are consistently part of the process of engagement for students and for their families. The other thing we'll mention is that um, there's different contributions and characteristics within the model that includes involvement with the schools, that includes those aspirations, again, the forms of support. But this offers utility when we actually consider the full context of parent and family engagement, and not to maybe minimize or essentialize it to a particular orientation session or one type of involvement that we might see with families, or one weekend of a parent and family weekend, which is a common thing that we might see within the US, right? That understanding that their contributions and characteristics are much more complex, they're much more layered, and they're much more consistent than a one-off weekend or an orientation, which is what um, I think is a really positive thing that we're seeing with all of the parent and family engagement offices that are emerging, that have grown, particularly within U.S. institutions. So this is the model itself. Oops. So you can see the spiral. You can see all of these different elements and factors that we've talked about in terms of self-efficacy and aspirations and networks, different dimensions of support, but also that all of these different elements, family and community and college characteristics and pre-college, are a constant, right? They're always there. The one thing that we really wanted to focus in on, particularly with the studies that then we created, was where does this institutional context come in, right? We know that this engagement is happening, but what is the responsibility of the institutions in terms of how they engage with particularly diverse families, first generation families, low income, and in the US context, Pell eligible financial aid eligible families, families of color, right? What does this look like in terms of who holds the responsibility within different institutional contexts? And so we created two different studies. The first one, both of them being a multiple case study design. The first one included 9 different institutions, both public and private, different institutional sizes and types, with enrollment as low as 1,000 students to over 38,000 students, so larger public institutions. Casandra and I spent so many hours at parent and family orientations, new student orientations, parent and family programming, and did over 200 hours of observations over the course of 2 different summers to understand again how institutions were framing that engagement, how they were engaging families, how they were communicating with families, how they were depicting families, right? So think back to some of those stereotypes that Casandra started with. And then we also did a number of individual interviews with orientation staff, with parent and family programming staff. We followed that with case studies with families. So 8 families, we met with them 3 times over the course of the first year of college for their student, because we wanted to understand what that first year transition looked like for them and for their students. Um, we asked in terms of inclusion criteria that families were first generation college families, low income families, and families of color. And we also did observations with them and asked them to share any reflections or documents that they had received from their institutions that helped to maybe unpack or help us to understand, again, those engagement strategies or the ways in which institutions were engaging with them. So what we're going to share with you is not necessarily findings from every single study. We've compiled them into a top 10 consideration. So this is takeaways maybe from both of the studies, big picture takeaways that we can consider. We've pulled in a few quotes and stuff, but we want you to kind of get the, I don't know, the best of the best of the data to take forward. And I think we've tried to make these practitioner oriented as well. All right, Casandra, I'm going to turn this back to you for the first one.
Okay, so this first one, a big takeaway that we saw was that we just need more inclusive ways to describe parents and families. So institutions talked about how, it's not just parents that they're seeing as the key supporters of these college students, that they're coming with significant others, friends, older siblings, grandparents, guardians, some involvement from some high school counselors who are wanting to be supportive. And so some of these institutions that are really trying to recast how they're describing these support networks that students have are going beyond that label of just parents. And so that's something that can be considered, is how do we include all of those forms of support that are so valuable to college students.
Number 2, recognize that parents and families experience a transition too. In the families that we spoke with, they noted and really talked about that shift pre-college, and then for them after the students transition and after going to college. One of the images that one of the staff members talked about was a tandem bicycle, the two-seater bicycle, right? And that maybe at first, as we think about K-12 engagement, the parents are sitting in that front seat and the child is sitting in the back seat, and the parents are kind of leading in terms of that engagement. And it's not that we completely disassemble the bicycle, right? Or we ask parents to step out of that picture. Maybe it's a shift in who's taking the lead on that bicycle itself, and that the child, then the student, is then in the front seat, kind of leading the way, developing that independence, but the parents are still part of it, and they're still engaged, and they're still cycling with them. And so that engagement shifts a little bit, and that transition happens for them as well, right? They're navigating new relationships. They're understanding, of course, new policies, right? FERPA or other types of policies at different institutions. And that transition includes different communication strategies. So, how families engage with their children or student in terms of communication might be that the students are then initiating that contact. So some became a little bit more or less hands-on, right, in the beginning, as they figured out what that bicycle or what that path or what that new relationship might look like. Number 3.
So with this third one, and we talked about this a little bit at the when we first jumped on the webinar, that it depends on whether the college or university that we're talking about has a particular parent and family program office, or what the resources are on different campuses, because that can really vary. But for within some of our data, we were finding that some staff members were feeling like anything related to what they would call diverse families, so students of color, maybe some low income students, that their responsibility would be relegated to a particular office, so multicultural affairs or cultural centers. And that's really problematic, right? So we want to think about who our default family is. And so for each campus, it's a matter of really looking at your data and understanding who are the families that you serve, and how can we each be responsible for serving all of those students and not relegating certain families to certain offices.
Number 4, recognize that support offered from families might not always be visible. And so some of that support includes emotional support, right? It might not always be that they can physically attend orientation sessions, for example, or those parent-family weekends that we mentioned, because of many things, because of jobs, because of perhaps they can't afford to travel. I mean, there are a number, right? Different responsibilities. So the support might look different. It might be emotional, it might be financial support, it might be general guidance and advice giving strategies and narratives. It might be food, right? I mean, there are so many different ways that families show that they're in support. And so one of the quotes that we pulled says, I told him, continue forward to college. This success is not going to be yours alone. It's going to be mine as well. When you reach the end, it will be my success as well. If you stay behind, I will be behind as well. And so really showing that the continued partnership really that families and parents are offering to their children. And we keep saying children because they don't ever stop being our children. Max was sharing at the beginning that, he had somebody in college. We both, Cassandra and I, have little ones. They're never not our babies and our children. But it becomes a different type of support and relationship as they grow and move forward.
And then fifth, another theme was that we don't want to ignore those concerns and fears that might be unique to families of color. So when we were collecting data, it was around the time in Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed by a police officer, and a lot of protests um, emerged from that, and parents were expressing fears about their, Black male sons, and how would the university respond within that context. And those conversations have continued. Obviously, Black Lives Matters, and so many stories of families who are really trying to make sense of major world events and what it means for safety in particular. Safety was a big theme. And so being able to address those fears and concerns directly is really important. It acknowledges the parents and how they're feeling in that transition, but also is addressing some legitimate fears that they have about their sons and daughters.
Number 6, consider who parents and families turn to for support. So this kind of goes back to recognizing that they are in their own transition as well. And so parents and families shared with us that they turn to other parents and family members. They turn to the different professionals that they meet at these institutional events. Their networks provide things like emotional support, sometimes even financial support, right? They're an information source. And for me, this all connects back to this notion of funds of knowledge. With funds of knowledge, it's different communities or different networks or different households that are providing those resources and support to one another. And so it makes sense that we would see this with collectivist orientation families as well. They also shared that the college choice process for them could be anxiety producing and stressful. And so when the institutions also offered that support, it was incredibly appreciated.
Seventh, this is definitely related to some of the themes that we've talked about assumptions that institutions have. So with this, we, you know, really looked at with some of those observational data, how institutions were describing parents and families, and it's a way to uncover some of our underlying assumptions that we have about first gen low income families of color, and whether we're serving those families or what assumptions we have about what their contributions are, whether their contributions are assumed to be positive or not. And so, really thinking about how we can build relationships earlier. Some families talked about how, the only time that they were contacted by someone at the institution was to ask for donations. So, some families were really hoping for really meaningful and effective relationship building, building trust over time, and really seeing a relationship over time. And related to that, I know one of our findings was that if a parent did reach out to an institution, whoever they talked to was the person that they would go back to. And so that can be something that we could use strategically to maybe try to pair them with someone who would be a really good supportive resource and someone that they could come back to time and time again. And then, examining institutional departmental policies and practices to see, is there anything that would be exclusive of particular parent and family configurations? So some of that might relate to cost or time involved, and what are we assuming that parents can take on, and who might be excluded as a result of that.
Number 8, I think this one is the thread maybe that pulls a lot of our work together. Value diverse cultures, value diverse families. We spent a lot of time with parent and family orientations and student orientations that were also Spanish speaking. And so given the geographic context that we were in, some of these institutions were in the South and Southwest within the United States, and they had larger Spanish-speaking communities and Spanish-speaking families. And so we tracked some of that as well. Earlier work, the precursor to the case studies where we sat in on many of these orientations, we started looking at orientation websites and really paid attention to, are they available in multiple languages? Do they have options or people available to support families if they're coming from a non-English home, right? If they're multilingual, if Spanish or another language is their first or home or preferred language. Some of that has shifted now with the use of AI, with the use of Google Translate, I think that compared to 10 years ago when we did some of this initial scanning of websites has shifted. But what we saw, especially with some of the open access institutions, was that they did offer Spanish speaking sessions, and it was well received, it was appreciated, and it really connected with families on a much more personal level. So this particular staff member who led the Spanish speaking family sessions, said, I really understand and identify with Hispanic culture. and have spent a lot of time immersed in it. I know what they value. I know how much families matter to Latino cultures and how when you support the family, the student can really succeed. And it was so, these sessions that she led were so culturally responsive and culturally affirming, and families really connected with that.
It's related to that valuing of family knowledge. There were some examples of partnering with parents and families for sessions. So, coming into the space of campus or particular programs or advising sessions, really valuing that perspective. And I know we're running short on time, but there we have another chart here that provides a few other examples of how institutions, got creative with really being more open and responsive to first gen families in particular. So, welcome sessions at orientation, valuing, the contributions of parents and families, offering opportunities for them to meet with each other and talk and provide resources to other families, providing waivers for orientation fees, panels that center their experiences, stickers that say, I'm a first gen staff member to kind of acknowledge that as a identity that can be celebrated. So really acknowledging emotions, lots of different examples here, but I hope it provides just a few of the kind of ways in which institutions were more responsive to these families.
Our final one is to incorporate family knowledge into program design and resources. The families bring so much in terms of that network knowledge, the communities they're connected to, cultural and historical knowledge. And so some of the institutions started giving them little buttons or ribbons or ways to identify that they had knowledge to share with other families, particularly other first generation college families. And so if they've had already had a child or a student go through the university, or if they currently have a child in college, they would tap into, meaning the parent family engagement offices would tap into these families so that they were integrating them as sources of support for other first generation families. And in essence, cultivating even more networks and connections along the way, while also validating, recognizing, and tapping into that incredible source of knowledge that the families already bring with them. So our big takeaway is that parent family engagement enhances academic achievement and success of students. They're engaged, they want to be engaged, they care, right? Therefore, for us, that institutional investment in parents and families is an institutional investment in students, right? They're not separate. They're one and the same in terms of how we think about um, contributing to creating and really supporting and cultivating those spaces of belonging for our students. So we will end there. We have different ways for you to contact us. We'd love to stay in touch with you. And Max, should I stop sharing and we can engage in conversation?